Okay, we're on.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, Bob, I just want to say thank you very much for a terrific paper. I mean, I learned so much from it, not just the historical material, but also the sort of quite penetrating discussions of various topics and modality in metaphysics. So there's a lot that I want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks to you too. I don't think I've ever had my historical work taken with such philosophical seriousness and rigor. So it's really a pleasure to get to engage with you on this stuff.
Okay, good. So let's. I mean, I've got various things I wanted to ask. Maybe I can just start with asking a few things, and then we can take. You might have some comments about me, and we can go back and forth. But just first of all, actually, I just had a couple of general comments to do with your own general comments about modern ways of thinking about modality. So here
Yeah.
I was thinking about. I mean, a couple of things. There was the remark towards the bottom of page 2 of your paper, where I take it you were referring to, I don't know, the hyperabundance of the United States.
That's right.
And our modern modal logic leads to these some sorts of sins of gluttony.
Yeah.
Then right at the end of the paper, so you sort of return to a similar theme, perhaps on page 26 at the very end of the paper, where you say that the tendencies of modern modal theorizing work against it, which is a conclusion about what's the correct formulation of, what's the correct kind of modal formulations that we should use for this or that purpose.
Yeah.
So the point that you say is missed by our modern procedures is that independently of contextual considerations, there's no fact of the matter about which modal values are correct. So I guess my question was, are those 2 points connected, or are they two separate criticisms of the modern approach? And secondly, yeah, did you have examples in mind?
Yeah. So, I mean, so first thing I suppose I should say is, you know, you're much more an expert on the contemporary scene than I am. So it's a bit silly for you to be asking me some of these questions. But my picture is that not so much, or not at all really, but there's a problem on the formal level in terms of sort of marking out the modal territory in the different ways, as you yourself show. I mean, we've got the tools to do this with, and to the extent we don't, you know, someone like you can come along and shape them. My point was not so much a formal point as more of a kind of an informal tendency that I feel in a lot of, at least in some contemporary modal theorizing, that leads people to think that, well, the default modal framework, and perhaps in some sense the true modal framework, is a kind of wide open quantification over all of modal space, all possible worlds. And of course, everybody who knows anything about this knows that you can do it differently, that you can restrict the quantification in various ways, restrict the access relationships, but there's a kind of a default bias, I might say, toward a more wide open kind of quantification. And I mean, just to give you a relevant example of what I had in mind, I think it's very common for people to look at historical claims about the necessity of the past, one of my cases, and to think, oh, that's simply confused. It's just false to say that the past is necessary. Anybody who talks that way doesn't understand modality. They're making a kind of a crude mistake about what necessity involves. And I think that's a product of a sort of a tendency to think that the true modality is more wide open than that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on one interesting thing, which is that there is a sense in which the sort of maximal modality, metaphysical possibility, if you like, is regarded as the sort of background against which all other modal notions can be defined. On the other hand, you might say that there are some, even in our sort of post-Kripke age, there are philosophers who've taken questions about the necessity of the past seriously. I mean, one example is Lewis, in a way, and the work that followed him on the asymmetry of counterfactual dependence. So Lewis, you know, was aware of and understood that there's a sense in which the future depends on the present, but the past doesn't depend on the present. The future would have been otherwise if the present had been otherwise, but the past would not have been otherwise if the present had been otherwise. And it's very natural to think of that, especially in light of Lewis's own possible world semantics for counterfactuals, as granting a kind of limited necessity to the past.
Right.
So I think there's some. I think obviously you're right that there's a kind of privileging of a certain kind of modality, but even within, since the 70s, but even within that, there are people who are doing something that could be interpreted as asking these questions.
Yeah.
Maybe when we get on to the issues about the necessity of the past, I wanted to bring up some other modern versions of that debate.
Yeah. Well, let me say in general, I was quite struck by your approach, which seems to really go quite in the opposite direction. You seem very, pragmatic was the word that came to mind for me. You seem very pragmatic in your willingness to count as a reasonable modal framework, whatever works for us.
Yeah.
Even sort of more so that way than I had been thinking of it myself until I started reading your comments. Whereas I was more inclined to think, well, there are going to be more and less kind of there are going to be approaches that better capture what we mean by necessity and possibility than others. You seem to more think, well, look, if it works for us in a certain sort of context, then that's fine and let's use it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that, in a way, that there's that's the way some philosophers like Quine have proceeded. Quine is quite clear that you can think about modality simply as an instrument which plays this or that role in argumentation, and whether something counts as necessary in one context doesn't mean it counts as necessary in another context, and there might even be no particular privileged or special context, and no real answer to the question what is really necessary and what's really possible. That's a sort of illusory question, perhaps a framework question, as they would call it.
Right.
Not Quine. So yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, thanks for that. Now, I wanted also to talk a bit about issues to do with the necessity. So there's a couple of substantive issues I want to talk to you about. One of them is on the necessity of the past, and one of them is on the necessity of the present. So on the necessity of the past, one thing I was curious about was the view, which I don't think is yours, but I think you report many people as having held, that the temporal theory of possibility somehow makes it unproblematical that the past is necessary. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's a very common reading of what's going on, and in fact, people have taken both the commitment to the necessity of the past and the commitment to the necessity of the present as a sign of an enduring commitment to temporal modality.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing was just whether that's right. So if you have a temporal view of modality, whether you are committed to the past being necessary in a way that the future isn't.
So I was very struck by your comments in that regard. I found them extremely illuminating. Part of what made them so illuminating to me is that I think they cut against the grain of the historical story in a way that's helpful. But the historical story, as I think of it, is that we have these old statements of a temporal modality, and in the paper I quote Diodorus Cronus to that effect, and you can find lots of others. They tend to be pitched in such a way that they do presuppose the necessity of the past and the present. They build it into their statement of temporal modality. Now you come along and you say, and you give your own formulation of temporal modality, and I think your formulation actually better captures what these authors ought to mean by temporal modality, but for some reason they build a temporal asymmetry into the way they characterize it. And I think the reason for that historically is that they had in mind, they had in the back of their minds at least the future case, and they didn't, whatever was going to happen, they didn't want to become determinists with respect to the future. They didn't want to block future contingency. And so they were from the very start trying to formulate it in such a way as to avoid, in such a way as to leave open future contingents. Whereas that's of course not your preoccupation. You're just trying to sort of in a formal way figure out how best to construe temporal modality. And so that leads you to do it in a much more sort of straightforward way, but it's a way that is probably going to block future contingents unless some further ad hoc move is made.
Okay, so yeah. So let's stick with the formulation of Cronus that you report on page 3 of your paper.
Yeah,
So here we have the possible is that which either is or will be true, the impossible that which is false and will not be true, etc.
yeah,
Okay, so now if we take a statement like and the necessary that which is true and will not be false, and so on. So if you take a statement like, so obviously there are statements of the form that Prior would have formalized as PX, so statements in which there's a kind of past tense operator around the outside, which are always going to be true, that's correct. But there are other statements about the past, like I have not been to Rome, which are not necessary. Even in this Diodorus Cronus formulation, they're not necessary.
yeah. That's good. Yes, that seems quite right. Yeah,
So
yeah,
even on this formulation, or to take the future case, if you take a statement like he shall reign forever, that's a statement which, if it's true, it will always be true.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. And so I think there needs to be to get the necessity of the past result. You're going to need to do a bit more work. You're going to need to restrict it to a certain class of sentences or propositions. You use the device of statements, right? That have a temporal mark, a kind of a date built into them.
Yeah, but and his statement about the future is then always going to be true as well, isn't it?
Right, and so that was why I said a moment ago that the path you're going down is one that looks like it's not going to give us future contingent.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there's yeah. I mean, there are cases where it's as Prior says, there are cases where you do get this result, but there are statements about the past which seem intuitively about the past that don't quite have it. So
yeah,
it's interesting. In a way, it's sort of slightly peripheral to some of my main concerns, which are about Scotus Spencer's Occam, but it was interesting. And then another thing I wanted to talk about was just this issue to do with, actually, there's a couple of things. I mean, one of them really was just to do with your comments towards the end of the discussion on the necessity of the past. Let me just find the passage. Yeah, so we're talking around page 11 now, so we're at the end of section 3 of your paper. I guess there's various ways I can think of that one might think there's a real issue about the necessity of the past. And they're all to do with the idea, as Dummett put it, that one might do something now in order that something should have happened in the past. And so I was thinking of two contexts that might have been, that I don't know, but people might have discussed in the 13th and 14th century. So one of them was retrospective prayer. And the other one was, so this is actually a little bit later, but the other one, so 16th century question, Calvinism and predestination. So would either of those have been questions which raise issues about the necessity of past or understanding?
Absolutely, in principle. In thinking, if you're thinking of cases where God is involved, then historically it's critical to keep in mind that the consensus view at this time was that God's outside of time, God's eternal. What that amounts to is quite controversial, quite difficult, not something we want to get into now, but that makes it a bit tricky to use those kinds of cases to make a point about the necessity of the past. Okay. There may be other kinds of cases that work better for the kind of point you're after, or the kind of question you want to push. Prayer, not from God's side, but from the human side, could raise those issues, depending on exactly how you formulate the case. Another kind of interesting case, in some ways maybe a cleaner case, are cases of prophecy, where someone is said to be prophetic with regard to the future. And then you can, and then, so if you think the future's open, if you're going through future contingents, and then you think, and such an event indeed happens, making such a person a prophet. Now, I mean, it's not very interesting to just have cases where you or I say something and it turns out to be true, and then it turns out that we said something true. But prophecy is a more kind of complicated case, where to be a prophet is not just to get lucky, as it were, but yeah, I mean, prophets presumably know what they're saying, or it's somehow grounded in some sort of knowledge on someone's part. So there's a lot of interesting features of those cases that can raise these sort of backward-looking questions about the necessity of the past.
I see. So is it to do with the idea, for instance, that what I do now will determine what I was prophesied to do?
Yes, that could be a case. I mean, there's a lot of questions about what the mechanism for prophecy is going to be. I mean, typically, of course, people will say, well, God just illuminated such a person to be a prophet. But the point would be, still, at this time in the past, I was a prophet. And if you're trying to assert that while holding on to the contingency of the future,
yeah,
it raises these sorts of questions.
So was there in this context a discussion of the case that Anscombe discusses, which is St. Peter and betraying Jesus? So that's a case where he was actually told that it was going to happen, as a prophecy, and yet presumably he knew that he was going to do it, and he knew that he was going to do it freely as well.
I would guess there are discussions of that particular case. I don't offhand know of any discussing that particular case. But once you start sort of thinking along those lines, you know, if you know the Bible at all, you'll be able to come up with other sorts of cases like that.
Sure, of course.
So take your pick.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess that was just a way of underlining a point that I wanted to make in connection with modern thinking as well, because of course there's kind of a lively dispute within modern philosophy on this topic, over issues like indecision theory and Newcomb's problem and so on, or questions about whether there's a purpose in doing something in order that something should have happened in the past. And that's a debate that was sort of inaugurated with the work of Dummett and Nozick in the 60s, but sort of continues now. So I think within the human sphere, setting aside these questions which are sort of above my pay grade about God being outside of time and, you know, his power of the past, our human power of the past, I think is something worth, you know, there are genuine questions about it.
Yeah.
And I suppose I myself do think in a deterministic scenario, we do have power over the state of, we do actually have power of the past, which we exercise all the time, because we have power over whether the past was such as to cause us to do this or that.
I think, you know, I read Lewis's famous paper back in graduate school, I suppose, and I don't think I had ever at the time read something I was so baffled by, and in a way, it's taken me decades to finally get my head around how, in this debate over free will, that sort of line of that sort of path may in fact be the most attractive path.
Yeah. We could talk a bit more about free will in a moment, because in connection with SCOTUS and the necessity of the present. But I wanted, maybe, is there anything you want to bring up at this stage, Bob?
Keep going. I feel like we're doing a good job hitting the things I wanted to talk about, following your line of thought. So keep going.
Okay, so then the next thing was just, I had a question about the distinction. So I drew a distinction in my paper between what I call monotonicity and what I call one-sidedness. So monotonicity is the idea that possibilities are diminishing over time. So there's a kind of arrow. In the presentation, I call it the Pasnau arrow of time, which is that things that are impossible, things that are possible can become impossible, but not the other way around. And it's often our choices that generate that process of restriction. So the difference between that and one-sidedness, by which I mean the necessity of the past. So it seems to me, at least in principle, that you can have the former without the latter.
Yes.
And that the issues to do with the failure of the conversion instances that you were discussing were actually more to do with Pasnau's arrow than they were to do with the necessity of the past.
I found the monotonicity, one-sidedness distinction extremely helpful. I take it part of your thought there is that monotonicity has at least an intuitive appeal to it, and it may be that some of what was driving folk here was they saw the appeal of monotonicity, but their way of getting it was via one-sidedness, via a kind of categorical commitment to the necessity of the past. And your thought is really we should pull those two apart. we should recognize the appeal of monotonicity, but we should see there are other ways of getting that rather than having to go full in for the necessity of the past.
That's right. That's right. So exactly, you can have
Yeah.
diminishing over time, even in cases of retrospective prayer and prophecy and all of these other things where you might think you have influence over. You can do something now such that it was always true that such and such. That's consistent with monotonicity. But it was interesting, the passages from Borodin that you describe. I mean, you were very clear, he was very clear that these questions are in large part verbal. But I didn't see him, did he actually explicitly connect the question about the Pasnau's arrow of time with the question about the necessity of the past, or did he just a separate thing that we
well, he makes this remark that's very brief, and I think it deserves more. It deserves further consideration, even more than I gave it in my paper. This distinction between narrative histories, what we ought to do in the context of a narrative history, and what we ought to do in the context of a demonstrative science. Mm-hmm. And that distinction is offered precisely to explain why sometimes it is appropriate to treat the past as necessary, and sometimes it's not appropriate. So in the case where our concern is with what he calls narrative histories, it's legitimate to treat the past as simply necessary. And this is in a logical context where we don't need to go into this here, but where he offers a kind of logical tool that allows us to treat the past as necessary. But then he says there's another way of doing it, and he offers a different kind of logical framework in which we won't treat the past as necessary, and that's in the context of demonstrative science. And I mean, the arrow of time is I'm invoking that myself, but it seemed to me he does have in mind, but when he talks about narrative histories, he's not exactly thinking of storytelling. I think he's more thinking of, say, natural history, if you like, cases where we're interested in a particular event and following it through time, and where it's important to respect the kind of the natural flow of events. Now you might think, oh, isn't that what we need to do in demonstrative science? Well, but by demonstrative science, he's thinking of something that holds universally, necessarily, effectively in a timeless sort of way. And so these sort of temporal considerations and the direction of time's arrow isn't relevant as he's thinking of it in the demonstrative sciences. I think it's a fascinating sort of move that he's making, and unfortunately he doesn't say a whole lot about it.
I see, that's very interesting. Yeah, so is it, so we can think of it in a way a little bit like in demonstrative science, if you think about quantifying over paths in phase space, for instance, you think about possible histories as well as possible futures of the universe. And they all have to follow the laws of nature or something like that.
That's right, and we would want our formulation of the way we would do science in that context is in terms of laws that would apply over the whole space and all of the branching paths.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, there's the epistemological issue there, which Hume obviously pressed very, very hard concerning how it is that laws can be known to be necessary. But I'm guessing here, but was it just that it was part of what science counted as science at this time?
Yes, absolutely.
And have to be ones that you can only know if they're securely true.
Absolutely, and I think you're right to think of Hume in this context, because I think Hume, one of Hume's most important ideas is to challenge that way of thinking, to challenge that conception of law, and to put in place something that's radically different, that's radically empirical in particular, in a way that even the earlier empiricists and even somebody like Newton had never conceived of doing.
Yeah, that's right. Newton and Locke and so on. I think that seems quite right. So then I had a question about.
Let me just, maybe I can just insert something else here that I wanted to comment on. It's worth noting in this context that for these Aristotelians, the central concept, one of the very most foundational concepts for an Aristotelian is the concept of potentiality. And I think part of what makes it complicated for us to sort out these earlier Aristotelian discussions is that sometimes when they talk about modality, they're thinking in terms of sentences or propositions, but sometimes they're thinking of the target of their analysis, something like a metaphysical power, a potentiality. And they want an account in their sciences that will explain the way potentialities work. And at this point, I'm thinking now of this point in your paper, where you kind of query this business about going from possibilities to impossibilities, going from impossibilities to possibilities, the direction in which we can go. And you say, well, in some sorts of cases, it looks like we'll go in one direction, but in other sorts, so my example had been, well, when it comes to sight, we go from seeing to being blind. Barring supernatural intervention, we don't go from being blind to be seeing. But then you make the point, well, but think of language. In the case of language, we go from not having the ability to having the ability. And it looks like it goes in the other direction. And I think, I mean, from an Aristotelian point of view, this is all extremely important and extremely complicated, because they've got, of course, this elaborate theory, many theories of potentiality, and this lies at the heart of their thinking about metaphysics and science. And so these are issues that aren't really part of my paper, but I think your comments made me see how a full grasp of this stuff would need to go down that path and think about these issues.
I see. So, okay. No, I'm willing to accept that, because the remarks I made there were pretty superficial, and they were just kind of expressions of my own sort of puzzlement, rather than, you know.
Yeah, I think it is puzzling.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, terrific. That's really helpful. So then the next thing I wanted to ask about was the issues about the necessity of the present, and the dispute between Scotus and Occam, and the idea of synchronic contingency. And so there's one thing was just this notion of this idea of instance and a kind of an ordering of simultaneous instance, which I tried to formalize as roughly speaking spheres of possible worlds. So the more inclusive of the larger spheres are prior instance, and the narrow spheres of the posterior instance, so that you get a kind of sense of possibility. But of course, I guess one question is, of course, I wasn't intended to be faithful to Scotus, but just to capture some of the things that were in his account. But one amongst probably many deficiencies of that account is that it doesn't capture anything of this idea of causation. Okay, so as you said in your paper, what underlies the simultaneous ordering in Scotus is the simultaneous causation. So I was wondering if maybe you could say a bit about, if I wanted to build that into my account, maybe if you could say a bit about the notion of causation that he would have been operating with. So was there a relationship between causation and necessitation, or was it just a totally different relationship that underlay simultaneous causation?
Scotus is a special case in that regard. So let me set Scotus aside and say just something just briefly about sort of the pre-Scotistic picture. Ironically, one of the points I want to make in the paper is that with regard to modality, Scotus is not it doesn't have the special importance that others have thought. But the question you just asked is one that I think Scotus is very influential on, this question about the link between causality and necessity. The view before Scotus is maybe not absolutely the first to take a different path here, but he's the most prominent. The view before this, at any rate, is that there is a very tight link between causality and necessity, to the point where really causes get defined in a certain sense in terms of a certain kind of necessitating antecedent, so that there's not really any room in these sort of characteristic medieval conceptions. There's not really any room for causation to occur contingently. What makes SCOTUS different is that SCOTUS identifies the human will as a special case where there is the possibility of this full-blown contingent causation at an instant, so that at an instant of time the will can do a thing or can do the alternative, and it's completely contingently open to do one or the other. And of course, it's a baffling sort of notion that we continue to be puzzled by, and you know, the sort of the dominant compatibilist position in philosophy thinks it doesn't make any sense. And SCOTUS is one of the early people to try to get a view of that sort off the ground and to break up the connection between necessity and causation.
I see. So in the example where the will you're eliciting the will, but you haven't willed this or that, or you haven't either willed or not willed, or it's contingent whether you have. If he removes the idea of necessitation from that relationship, what's left to make it worth calling a causal relationship at all, on his view?
That's a great question. I think it's unclear. I don't know that he has an answer to that question. Perhaps he could try to appeal to the way in which forms enter into their causal thinking. So the will is an efficient cause in this context, and it's an efficient cause that's producing a certain sort of act. Initially an act within a human being, and then that translates to something out in the world where I turn on the water faucet or whatever it may be. So the will is the efficient cause, but in a case like this, formal causes also play a role. There's a kind of a formal connection between cause and effect, and it's disputed exactly how that's to be understood. But any Aristotelian analysis of causation, at least in the Middle Ages, is going to appeal to some sort of formal tie between the form in the cause and the form in the effect. And I mean, that all by itself is not enough to answer your question, but that's sort of gesturing toward some of the resources that he might have wanted to deploy in this context.
I see, that's interesting. So by the sound of it, the tie, or whatever it is that's going to be doing this work, will have to provide the basis for an asymmetric relationship. So it can't just be having something in common, because...
That's right. And that's a good way of putting why simply appealing to some sort of formal connection is not going to be sufficient, because that looks like it's too symmetric to get us cause and effect.
I mean, it's too symmetric to give us an order. What we need is an order, right?
Yes, so that's right.
Transitive asymmetric relation. We haven't got that if we've got, exactly, just commonality of form. So there needs to be something more. It was interesting because I was thinking of various ways to put that into the model, and I didn't. And I didn't, it just complicated things too much. But I thought you could do it if you thought about it, if you put it in something like, if you have something like a sort of safety condition. So if you have something like, all the nearest worlds where I will something and ones where I will A, nearby worlds where, then that would sort of, that's in a sense a kind of causal, something like what we call a causal relation. But of course, that's one interpretation, nothing in Scotus's thinking.
Now to be clear, we're both operating under the assumption that temporally speaking, cause and effect will be simultaneous. That's the case the papers focus on. Other people deny the simultaneity of cause and effect, and that then gives them a further tool that they can use to produce this ordering. They can appeal to temporal orderings.
I see. So Occam denied that, for instance, simultaneity?
I think Occam accepts the simultaneity of cause and effect. I guess I'm not completely certain about that. I'd have to look it up. But the difference is that Occam doesn't think that contingency has to be captured in that instant, where the instant of causation. He doesn't think the contingency has to be captured there.
I see. Actually, good. So that brings me on to one of the other things I wanted to ask about, actually, which was to do with, it's a very interesting idea. I did find a passage in Scotus where he says that it's actually a matter of experience that one acts, not only that one acts, but one acts contingently, because one is
Yes.
aware when one acts that one could have acted otherwise. Now that was what I thought he said. I mean, is that right? Is that his own
Yes,
epistemology of contingency? Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, okay, so maybe could that have been the kind of thing that Hume had in mind? Hume has a discussion in the treatise and also in the inquiry about velleities and about this sort of this illusion, as he thinks of it, that there's this sort of, you're aware of a kind of shadow of other things you could have done when you did something, and that's what gives you the idea that you could have done otherwise. When you do A, you could have done B instead. All you're ever really aware of doing A, then later on doing something else, and that these velleities are just they don't actually tell you anything about what you could have done at the time. Could that have been the kind of thing that Hume, you think, was addressing in those sorts of passages?
Yes, and he wouldn't have needed to know Scotus, because I think that sort of thought, it runs through the history of these debates about free will, these appeals to introspection and to our sense of spontaneous freedom right now at this moment.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how much weight Scotus would have put on that introspective evidence for this particular metaphysical debate we're having. After all, I mean, we're talking about a durationless instant of time as opposed to something that might just take, an unmeasurable and unintrospectable duration. I would like to think Scotus would have seen that for that sort of fine-grained metaphysical question, introspection wasn't going to get him very far.
I see. Yes, of course, you're right. So there's a difference between that very sort of, as exactly said, a very fine question about what happens in an instant and our kind of everyday experience about.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you say in your paper is exactly right. I would just say I don't know whether Scotus would have pushed that particular part of his argument to make this particular point. I think the thing that Scotus would have wanted to stress more in the connection we're focused on is this idea that the kind of freedom we're after, the kind of openness to alternatives we're after, for it to do the work we want it to do, that is to make us genuinely responsible, requires that right now at this instant I have this possibility. And that's why I think he can most effectively respond to the move you make in the paper, which, as you know, is similar to the way Occam also responds to Scotus, the move of appealing to either before or after to get us some kind of contingency. Scotus really wants to say, look, if it's not at the very instant of the decision, then you're not responsible at that instant. But if you're not responsible at that instant, then when are you responsible?
I see. Okay, so I mean, one certainly could push back against that. I mean, you could say, whether you're responsible at T, it doesn't supervene on what's happening at T. Right?
Yes.
And that is, I mean, that from a modern perspective, that's the kind of thing people say in connection with Frankfurt cases, for instance. They might say, whether you're responsible for what you've done might depend on whether you could have chosen otherwise 5 minutes ago, or what the actual cause of history of your act was. So there's an assumption, I guess, that you can only be responsible at T if you could have done otherwise at T, and you might challenge that.
It's interesting. That's a very familiar response, of course. It seems to me to concede a lot to Scotus in a way. I wonder whether Occam would have been happy with that. Occam's also a libertarian, as we now categorize these things. Occam's an indeterminist. He's by no means wanting to go down some kind of compatibilist line of the sort that's familiar to us. And Occam still thinks, no, at the instant of choice, it's determined, it's necessitated. But maybe what you're showing is that even Occam would have to make that sort of move that we associate with compatibilism and appealing to some sort of responsibility at an earlier time.
Well, I mean, all he needs to appeal to I mean, I don't know. I think in a way I'm just agreeing with what you say on pages 20 to 21, which is that all Ockham needs is Ockham can be a libertarian. It's just he appeals to contingency at an earlier time.
Mm.
So he does need. He still thinks contingency is necessary for responsibility. He does think that. It's just he thinks it's contingency at an earlier time that's necessary for responsibility.
Yeah, so maybe it's simply a mistake to think of that sort of line as a compatibilist line. Maybe these are just separate issues.
Yeah, I think they're separate. I mean, there's the issue that it's a historical question. So the issue that whether you're free doesn't supervene on what's going on at that time. That's one question. Separate question whether what it does supervene on is anything to do with what you could have done. Right? I mean, yeah, you're right. You're right. Those are two separate questions. So I very much agreed with the passage in your own paper where you said, the possibility of Ockham's account suggests that we should be cautious in accepting the often voiced conclusion that a libertarian conception of will requires synchronic contingency.
Yes.
Yeah. So that seems quite right. You can be a libertarian and not. I mean, I'm not a libertarian, but you can be a libertarian and still reject the need for synchronic contingency, just as long as you drop this claim about supervenience.
Yeah, and you have a very surprising line on this whole topic. I would have thought the usual position that people would take is that Scotus's conception of instance of nature is incoherent and has to be rejected. But we need something like that if we're going to be libertarians. And you say, no, on the contrary, we can make perfectly good sense of Scotus's conception of these instances of nature, and we can formulate a conception of modality in that way, but we don't need to.
Yeah.
I was very struck by that. I think it's a very surprising picture to take from this.
Yeah, I think you don't. So, but what about the argument? So, if we think about the case of the instantaneous being, now correct me if I'm wrong. So, the argument concerning either God who exists in an instant or an angel who exists in an instant, would equally apply to the first instant of any creature's existence. So, would Ockham have been committed to saying that angels are not free in the first instant of their existence?
I suppose Ockham is going to have to. Well, I was going to say that he might have to bite the bullet on that and just say that freedom would require an angel to exist for longer than an instant, but. If he addresses this expressly, I'm forgetting what he says. But it may be as well that he could make the move that I think you make of saying, well, counterfactually speaking, if the angel had existed, then it would have had that possibility. That's certainly something that he might well have thought as well.
I see. So the idea is that an angel is free just means that if it had existed for some prior period of time, it would have had a certain possibility for acting otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. What could make such a counterfactual? I see. Okay.
Well, you might think that there are facts about the angel's nature, and the larger world in which it's embedded that allow us to make that claim as a counterfactual.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Okay. So maybe right. So maybe he was. Yeah, because that wasn't quite the way I was thinking of dealing with it. But of course, the way I was thinking of dealing it was, would have not pleased Ockham at all, because it was indeed biting the bullet and saying the angel doesn't act freely. But the reason I had for doing that was to do with a thoroughly secular conception of the point of attributions of freedom and responsibility.
Right.
Which is ultimately, if they serve the if you have some kind of, I don't know, Dennett style account of these things where you think the point of attributing freedom and responsibility is as an incentive to all of us, then it just doesn't matter whether you attribute freedom to acts that are accidental, insane, or perhaps done by creatures that don't deliberate about them. So withholding freedom from instantaneous beings would do no harm. Would do nothing to frustrate the point of the concept.
I see. Yeah, that I think really is alien to the way Ockham was thinking about this. I think Ockham thought that he could capture just as robustly as Scotus this full-blown libertarian intuition. And why he wasn't so concerned in an instantaneous in getting that result instantaneously. It's not entirely clear. He more sort of presents it as a formal result you can get. You don't need to appeal to an instant. You can get true contingency by doing this overtime analysis, and that's sufficient. And as to my memory, he doesn't make very clear what he wants to say, what he would say about an instantaneous case.
What about the case? So okay, so let me just think, because this is interesting, and I hadn't really thought properly about it. So this sort of counterfactual proposal that Occam has in mind, that the angel acts freely if it existed for some time prior to its act, it would have been it would have been contingent that it chose that way rather than another way, or something like that. So would that apply also to, is God thought to exist necessarily instantaneously on this view, or is it just contingent that God?
Yes, and I mean, you said exist instantaneously. That might be a misleading way to put it. Exist eternally.
I see. Exist, but not over any duration, or is it?
That's right, but that's not just obviously. Well, nothing's obvious, I suppose, in this domain. But let's make sure we're not confusing God's eternal mode of existence with what we're imagining for an instantaneous angel. The angel really would just exist for a durationless instant of time. It would exist in time, but for just an instant of time.
I see. And okay, so in that case, so in the case of God, Occam could say that he acted freely for some other reason?
Well, even though I was at pains to distinguish the angel case and the divine case, in a sense, it comes down to the same problems for God, because there's no change in God. That's part of what you get with divine eternality. You get an absence of change, and so there's no prospect of any sort of ordering of any real sense. Now, Scotus thinks you can demarcate a kind of ordering in God that's not a temporal ordering, but again, an order of nature, and he thinks you can do that in God. Occam rejects that approach, as you would expect that he would, given that he rejects it in the human case. And so for Occam, there's no way to create the kind of ordering in God that would make it easy to introduce contingency there. So it's something of a puzzle. And again, you could try to run some kind of counterfactual story and say, well, God could have chosen otherwise. And that's something that Occam believes. Occam thinks, yes, God could have chosen otherwise. So there's some kind of robust contingency in God's will. But it's not entirely clear how he's going to get that result.
I see. Okay. Yeah, so that's very interesting. And then I just have one other more sort of general question, which is again my sort of ignorance, which is just to do with the connection between these questions about freedom and perhaps some larger questions. So on the one hand, political questions, on the other hand, historical questions. So just on the historical questions, obviously Locke describes these cases where one does something voluntarily but couldn't have done otherwise. And I was wondering whether there were discussions of cases like that in this context, so distinguishing between voluntariness and the kind of freedom that requires contingency. And second, I was just connecting it with whatever political value freedom would have had in this period, or whether it mattered, whether it was connected to things like that.
Yeah, these are issues I've been thinking about a lot, and in fact, this paper is at some point hopefully going to be part of a larger project, a book project, to sort of think, to sort of ask the kinds of larger questions you're raising about freedom in this period. The notion of the voluntary goes back to the ancients. They have a much more robust discussion. In Aristotle, for instance, there's a much more robust discussion of what it is to be voluntary than there is a discussion of freedom. And people, of course, think of the two as going hand in hand, but you're right to wonder whether they come apart in certain sorts of ways. Aristotle himself gives the example of sailors who they're in the middle of a fierce storm, and the only way for them to save themselves is to throw their cargo off the ship. And he wants to say that, well, he asks the question, is that voluntary? And, in a sense it is, in a sense it isn't. And so he defines that problem, and that then subsequently has a long history of discussion. What someone like Scotus takes himself to be doing is defining this very robust category of the voluntary that's completely free from any sort of causal necessitation or any sort of determinism. But there's a long history of people being willing to think about the voluntary in much more flexible ways and much weaker ways. And then I think this is something I hope to argue for in the future. I think this change in thinking about freedom and about modality does come at the start of a period in history where people become much more concerned with these sorts of issues, and political autonomy becomes much more important in people's thinking, and there simply is a lot more freedom among a larger range of people. The beginning of the 14th century marks a time at which both popes and kings have a lot less authority, in which parliaments begin to have more autonomy vis-a-vis the king, in which church councils begin to have more autonomy vis-a-vis the Pope. And so these issues are very, very important in the 14th century. I wouldn't say that it all goes back to this changed conception of modality by any means, but I think the way in which Scotus and Occam are beginning to think about this very seriously and intently shows that these wider set of issues are very much on their minds.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've often thought that, the thing that I care about, whether it's compatible with determinism, has got to be is something that must have something to do with notions like voluntariness, coercion, authority, political control, and all of the things that people actually care about and fight for. And it's a question of whether what that's got to do with modality or determinism and so on. That's perhaps most interesting, rather than.
Yeah. And one way to think about these debates is, the pages of Scotus and Occam, which go on for thousands of pages, are full of very dense, intricate metaphysical discussions, many of which have been completely forgotten and will probably never be written about. These are topics that we find them interesting. Their contemporaries found them interesting. They led to massive discussions by later generations of philosophers immediately after Scotus. That's why Occam is responding at length to Scotus on this point. These issues got real traction at this period in the history of philosophy because I think they struck people as really meaningful and important in broader sorts of ways to what they were worried about.
Yeah, they obviously are. And the other thing that struck me, of course, was how vital and alive the whole discussion was. Well, it was very exciting to learn about it, as well as obviously I learned a great deal from your paper too. Well, thank you very much, Bob. I think that's most of the things I wanted to talk about. Were there other things you wanted to raise, maybe?
I'm quite happy with this. I could go on and on, but I think we've probably recorded enough of ourselves talking. But this has been great for me. One of the highlights of my confinement period.
Yeah, me too. It's been terrific. So thank you so much.